This podcast will take you through how to answer a question about the establishment of the Federal Republic of Germany, and in particular Adenauer's role as, quote, the founding father of West German democracy. What you're looking at here on the first page is a scan of the essay, which is in the revision guide, which was actually awarded a level 4. Let's just zoom in on the question first of all. Okay, so there's the question at the top. To what extent does Konrad Adenauer deserve his reputation as the, quote, founding father of West German democracy? And we'll look in more detail at analysing the question in a minute, but I just really want to draw your attention to the quote, the founding father of West German democracy. The key word is democracy, the founder of democracy in Germany, in West Germany, in the years 1949 to 1960. Now, I'm not going to take you through the whole of this answer, other than the fact that, as I have said on several occasions, what an examiner will do is they'll read the introduction, then they'll read the opening sentences of each paragraph to see whether it is related to the actual question. Okay, so having established that the question is very much about, was Adenauer the creator of West German democracy? Let's have a quick scan to see whether whether this answer is actually focused on the question. Okay, so introduction. Adenauer became the first Chancellor of the FRG in 1949 at the age of 73. He remained Chancellor until 1963. When aged 87, he reluctantly gave up office. A poll of German people conducted in 2003 ranked Adenauer as the best German ever. He is seen as the man responsible for West Germany's rapid political, economic and moral rebirth, but does he deserve such accolades? It could be that he benefited from, rather than created, the economic miracle of the 1950s. Ultimately, this miracle probably had more to do with the establishment of West German democracy than Adenauer. My immediate reaction to that is it is focusing more on economics and West Germany's success in general terms than it is on the issue of democracy. It just loosely mentions democracy in the very final sentence, but democracy is not central to the introduction, so not a particularly strong introduction. In a few minutes, I'm going to show you an example of a strong introduction to this question. Okay, I then have a quick glance through the opening sentences of each paragraph. So the first one, Adenauer, ex-mayor of Cologne, was a Catholic Rhinelander who detested Prussian Protestantism, no mention of democracy. In fact, read on a little bit further, it's starting at the beginning. Adenauer, 1917 to 33, it moves into the war years, it moves to the end of the war. I'm immediately thinking, a bit of narrative going on here. It's not really focusing on the question. There's no real analysis emerging about democracy there, the creator of democracy. I then look at the next paragraph, opening sentence. Economic recovery was Adenauer's most significant domestic success. So I'm thinking to myself, dodging the question. This essay question is asking the candidate to analyse democracy, how Adenauer established democracy, and almost straight away the answer is moving into economics. I'm thinking, well, how is that relevant to the question? Okay, I move on to the next one. Adenauer's governments had other achievements. It's now appearing as a bit of a list. In fact, you've got that word success there. So I'm starting to think now, actually, this candidate is answering a different question. This candidate is opting out of the question they are being required to answer, which is about how far, to what extent Adenauer created democracy, and is actually choosing to answer a different question, something along the lines of what were Adenauer's achievements, or how successful was Adenauer? It's a different type of question that's being answered. So far I'm not particularly impressed. Move on to the next paragraph. All the sure signs of moving into a narrative really here. The paragraphs are beginning with dates. By the mid-1950s, other factors were emerging to secure Adenauer's continued success. There again, we're getting the impression, and you look at the next one here, not surprisingly, Adenauer's perceived record of achievement translated into electoral success. I wonder whether this candidate is actually writing an answer to the question, how successful was Adenauer? Okay, if that were the question, then this, I think, would be a strong answer. But there's no reference to democracy coming through in the topic sentences of these paragraphs. Let's move on to the next one. At long last, Adenauer's style of leadership has been called Chancellor Democracy because of the dominating personal authority he wielded in government. At long last, clearly a bit of focus on democracy there. And then you move to the conclusion. There is no doubt that the state of German democracy was far stronger in 1960 than it had appeared in 1949. So clearly, by the time we get to the conclusion, the candidate is focusing in on the issue of democracy, but it has taken a long time to get through to it. So the issue is the analysis is not sustained. The answer builds up towards analysis at the end, whereas a really strong A-level essay would have relevant analysis in each paragraph of the actual answer. So you then get to the actual mark. Surprisingly, it achieved level 4. Now, level 4 actually covers grades C and B. I would imagine this would be the very low end of a level 4. I think it's a generous mark, to be honest. My gut reaction looking at this is this would probably be more likely a grade D, but it has been graded level 4, which would put it into at least a C grade. I think that the saving grace, if you actually look through it, is yes, it is absolutely packed with knowledge. And a lot of the knowledge is relevant. It's just that the knowledge is not being explained. The relevance is not explained to the question. So yeah, you've got lots of dates. You've got electoral information, the percentage of the votes, the elections. You've got the 5% rule. You've got lots and lots of detail all the way through. Like I say, particularly knowledgeable about dates and the elections. So clearly this candidate knows about Adenauer, gets into the 5 R's: reconstruction, reintegration, restitution, restoration, relations, etc. 1949 collective bargaining law. There's some good information in here, but it's not really been related to the issue of democracy. It's implicit, but it is not explicit. So going back to the actual comment, it's a level 4 essay. It contains a number of general points that show some understanding of the question. Okay, so yeah, it relates to the question, particularly towards the end. It's well written. It demonstrates a detailed and wide-ranging knowledge. Okay, so this is why it just about gets into a level 4. It contains some analysis, yes, towards the end, but unfortunately not fully sustained. Okay, because for much of the answer, it's really answering a different question about success. So generously marked, I think. Certainly not level 5. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take you through my own plan to this answer, which would be a level 5 response. A level 5, remember, is a grade A or A star. So let's move on to the next page. Okay, so hopefully you've printed off your copy of this plan. I would suggest, I'm not going to take you through sentence by sentence. The advantage of a podcast is you can just pause it and read. So I would suggest you have this document in front of you, and when I tell you to pause and read, do that, and then play. Take it off the pause. Okay, so first of all, question analysis. Okay, so make sure you answer the question, not the question that you want to answer. The quote in the question, and that's the point I made earlier, is that Adenauer was or had a reputation as the founding father of West German democracy. The question is not Adenauer had a reputation as the founding father of West Germany, which is a very, very common mistake and one that candidates often make. So it's really reading that question carefully. The emphasis is on the word democracy. So the word democracy must be central to your answer. If you interpret the question as he was the founding father of West Germany, you will then slip into the mistake that the candidate made with the answer in the revision guide. In other words, you will end up writing an analysis of Adenauer's successes and failures. That was the mistake in the revision guide. And so, for example, the candidate wrote a paragraph about the economic miracle, but didn't relate the economic miracle to the issue of democracy. The candidate wrote about Western integration, but didn't link it to the issue of democracy. It's the linkage to the issue of democracy that will score you the marks. Next point, basics of how to plan an A-level answer. Never plan your answer from your notes. Always put your notes to one side so that they don't distract you, and instead plan your answer from the question. All you have in front of you is a blank sheet of paper with the question at the top, and then you plan from the question. You look long and hard and you really think about the question, and you apply your own knowledge to what you're looking at to draw more from the question than the actual words on the page. So the question gives you a proposition that Adenauer was the cause of West Germany's democracy. The question asks, to what extent? This means that you need to weigh the proposition against other factors. So logically, having just looked at that question, okay, so the question is about West German democracy in the years 1949 to 60, and it gives a proposition that Adenauer was the founder of that, and it says to what extent. Okay, so logically the essay will therefore consist of 3 building blocks. So for argument's sake, I'm just going to call them block X, block Y and block Z. And the reason I use those terms X, Y and Z is it is like a formula, but you can use this formula for many different types of history essay questions at A level. So I'll take you through how to do this. Okay, so the X, Y, Z approach. So block X is basically taking the proposition in the question. The proposition is Adenauer deserves the reputation as being the founder of West German democracy. So block X, you agree with the proposition. So your line of argument is Adenauer does deserve the reputation because. Okay, and then example. You can put in a little bit of knowledge, okay? Adenauer's deeply committed democratic values, his role in creating the basic law. But it's the first bit, the line of argument, that comes from looking at the question. That's why you don't have your notes next to you when you are planning your answer, because if you plan an answer with your notes there, you will get distracted by the detail. You've got to let the question lead the planning. So block Y, then, the mid part of your answer, is you turn it around and you say the proposition in the question is not true. So your line of argument is Adenauer does not deserve the reputation because. And then block Z, there were other causal factors. Your line of argument, other factors contributed to Germany's democratic development. Without Adenauer, arguably Germany would still have developed as a democracy because. So you've got your three building blocks just by looking at the question, not by looking at your notes. And having worked out your three building blocks, you can then look at your notes and think to yourself, right, which information would slot into which building block. So with the first block, the proposition is true. Adenauer's deeply committed democratic values, his role in creating the basic law. The second building block, turning it around, Adenauer does not deserve the reputation. You can look at Adenauer's style of leadership. There were occasions when he acted in a very undemocratic way. Block Z, other causal factors. You could look, for example, at other individuals such as Erhard, the contribution of the Americans and the British and the French, the contribution of impersonal factors that helped Adenauer, such as luck, the Korean War, provided the context for the long-term economic recovery. So you construct the skeleton of your plan by looking at the question. That's your line of argument, and then you slot in relevant information behind the line of argument to support and develop the line of argument. So in the detailed plan that follows, examples of supporting information are italicized, but note they are only examples, not a complete list. Let's go on to the next page then, which is the actual detail plan itself. And we'll start off with the introduction. Now, I've written quite a lot here for you about how to write an introduction. And I've written at the bottom there an introduction. That is my introduction. Okay, but what I've done is I've just given a little bit of context as to my thinking processes to come up with that particular introduction. So let's take a look at the background, okay? Really important to write a sharp, interesting introduction. Again, if you look at the revision guide, page 64, the examiner was not impressed by that introduction. So you've got to get the examiner on your side with the introduction. And as I said there are countless routes, so I misspelled the word roots there, routes to a good introduction. The key is to use your knowledge of the period, to take what you know to convince the examiner that you understand what the question is about, the underlying context of the question, why they're bothering to ask you to give 45 minutes of your life to write about this. There's got to be a good reason to ask you this question. Okay, so you've got to apply your knowledge, and that needs to be your wider knowledge to the question, to sort of like understand what's behind the question, what sits there. So you will, of course, know that Hugo Preuss, and you're thinking, what's this got to do with it? This is about 1919. Well, this is everything to do with it. You will know that Hugo Preuss, who wrote the Constitution of the Weimar Republic, attempted to create a model democracy in 1919. And you will, of course, know he did not succeed. It fell apart. By 1930, a group of elites close to the president used Article 48 to bypass parliamentary rule. Democracy effectively disappeared in 1930. 3 years later, it completely disappeared when they appointed Hitler, who within 6 weeks had created a popular mandate for a legal revolution, which dismantled democracy from within legally. Okay, there's your context. Okay, now although this is a question about Adenauer and the West German democracy, sitting behind it is the fact that they had a go at creating a democracy before World War II in the 1920s with all those intentions, and it failed. And thus, West Germany and Adenauer, he succeeded where the Weimar Republic failed, or at least that's what the question is suggesting. It suggests that Adenauer created an improved, more stable form of democracy. Why was it stable? Because it had firm foundations. Um, it was much more stable than the Weimar democracy. The Weimar democracy failed because it was unpopular with millions of Germans. It also failed because Germany had little support from abroad, whereas 20 years later, the West German democracy succeeded for the opposite reasons. It was popular with millions of West Germans, and it did have support from abroad, especially America, Britain, and France. So the question, sitting beneath the question, is asking you to consider how far Adenauer was responsible for creating the improved, longer lasting democracy, or whether there were other factors. So there's sort of the background thinking that goes into what the question is about. Now, in the exam, that's got to happen fairly quickly inside your head. You haven't got time to sort of like belabor the point, but you've got to look at that question. You've got to think about it. If you're going to write a quality A-level answer, if you just blunder in, as indeed many candidates do, and in certainly the revision guide, the candidate didn't really look long and hard at the word democracy, then you're not going to write such a strong answer. What I've done here then is, as I made the point here, you don't need to write all of that in your introduction. A good introduction needs to be punchy. It needs to show an understanding of the question. It needs to indicate the line of argument. This then would be my introduction. I'm just going to read it to you. In just 14 years, from 1949 to 63, the Federal Republic of Germany succeeded where the Weimar Republic of 1919 to 33 had failed. In the same time span, the new West Germany saw the creation of a successful democracy characterised by stable, decisive government and built on secure twin foundations: popular support at home and international backing abroad, albeit only from the West. This was in stark contrast to the failed democracy of the Weimar years, characterised by weak, indecisive coalition governments, lack of popular support, and isolated from the West. The FRG's first and only Chancellor during this 14-year period, Konrad Adenauer, has acquired a reputation as the, quote, founding father, quote, of this new successful form of democracy. Indeed, many historians use the term Chancellor democracy to describe his style of leadership. This essay will argue that other factors caused a successful democracy in West Germany in the 1950s. For example, other individuals such as Ludwig Erhard played their part, as did the changing international context, such as the Korean War. In the final analysis, though, Adenauer deserved his reputation as founding father. Okay, so look at the elements of that introduction. It places the question into a bigger picture, into a wider context, by relating it to the failure of the Weimar Republic, where democracy did not fail. It makes lots of synoptic connections there, and some of them are interesting. Very interesting. Adenauer was Chancellor of Germany for 14 years. The Weimar Republic lasted 14 years and it had 15 chancellors. Okay, on the whole, chancellors in the Weimar Republic lasted for less than a year on average, whereas West Germany had one chancellor for 14 years. There's a wonderful comparison there. Adenauer's chancellorship lasted as long as the whole of the Weimar Republic, just one chancellor. So that's clearly a good hook to pull the examiner into the answer that you're going to write. Okay, so implicit here in the introduction, or explicit, you've explicitly said that to really understand the West German democracy, you have to constantly relate it to the Weimar Republic, which I would hope you would then do in the main body of the answer. Okay, so there's the introduction. Notice at the end of the introduction, it gives a clear indication as well as to where the essay is going to go. It pretty much tells you the conclusion. In the end, I will conclude that he does deserve his reputation, but it's not as simple as he is the only creator of democracy. There were other factors, and it gives a little taste of what the other factors were. It says other individuals. It mentions Erhard. The changing international context, the Korean War. It just gives little tasters of other things that are going to go into the answer. Okay, so that's the introduction. Let's move on. So the main body of the answer will then consist of 3 building blocks. I've made the point here, just because you've identified 3 building blocks for your answer doesn't mean you give an equal amount of time to each. Okay, you don't have to do that. So you've got your building blocks at X, Y, and Z. Now, Y and Z deal with the counter arguments, okay? Whereas building block X is supporting the proposition. I know that ultimately I am moving in a direction. My conclusion is that Adenauer does deserve that reputation. So clearly, therefore, I want to spend more time and give more space to building block X, which is supporting the proposition. And I know I've got more to talk about there. Okay, Adenauer was, in my mind, absolutely central. So I'm going to give more time to that. Probably more than half of the main body of the answer will be building block X. Building blocks Y and Z, which then look at the counter arguments, it turns it around and argues that presents other arguments. Yes, got to develop them, but probably between them a third of the answer. So the bulk of the answer will be building block X. So now let's have a look at building block X. What basically are we saying here? So this supports the proposition. Adenauer does deserve the reputation. There's our line of argument. There is the topic sentence. Okay, that's what I'm looking for at the beginning of the paragraph. Now, how many paragraphs? Would this be 1 paragraph or 2? You've got to use your common sense. Okay, as you'll see in a minute, down here, a central part of it is the basic law. I think the basic law, there's so much to say there, that certainly would deserve a paragraph to itself. But the other elements you may want to combine. But the line of argument is he does deserve his reputation as founding father, okay, for the following reasons. Now, I think you could probably develop a whole paragraph at the beginning about his aims and attitudes, as does the candidate in the answer in the revision guide. But the candidate in the revision guide tells a story of Adenauer's early life. I think it doesn't start with a strong topic sentence. What you want to say is Adenauer was a committed Democrat. He believed in democracy. Okay, so how can you develop that point? He was a committed opponent of both communism and Nazism. Okay, for example, in his early career, he supported Allied actions to remove Prussian militarism. He lived through the Weimar era. He had a deep understanding that Weimar democracy was inherently flawed. He was the mayor of Cologne. He lived through the failed Weimar experiment, so he understood the weaknesses of Weimar democracy. And he in particular understood that the economic failure of the 1920s led to political weakness. And he was determined as a result, after 1945, when he came back into politics, to create an improved version of the old Weimar constitution. The question is about founding father. Okay, as a founding father, he took the old constitution and he made it better. So, for example, Article 48, he understood was a weakness of the Weimar Constitution because it enabled the Prussian elites to put Hitler into power. Adenauer had a deep understanding that a stable, prosperous West Germany would act as a magnet of freedom and prosperity and pull East Germans back to the West. Okay, he had that deep understanding. So he was prepared to sacrifice the East. He was prepared to have a divided Germany because, in his view, in the long term, that would eventually lead to reunification. I then think you need to move into, you're still supporting the proposition, but clearly the main argument then was the basic laws. I put that in bold, in capitals there. This is a key part of the answer, so give more space and time to this point. So remember, I've not written the detail into this, but Adenauer was a founding father. Okay, you know that because he was the president of the Parliamentary Council whose job it was to draw up the basic law. So he was instrumental in writing the constitution of the Federal Republic of Germany in 1948 to 49. Now, you've got about 5 or 6 sides of notes on this. You can't sort of like bring everything into your answer. You simply wouldn't have time. All you can do is cherry pick and explain 2 or 3 examples. The best ones to build in are obviously the 5% rule needs to be mentioned. Mention the notion of personalised proportionality. I think that was Article 67. Which strengthened the position of the Chancellor. Okay, so the voting system, it was a combination of the old proportional representation, but also drawing on elements of the British first past the post system. Remember, all West Germans had 2 votes. How democratic is that, giving West Germans 2 votes? The constructive vote of no confidence, I think that was actually Article 67, which was the vote that basically meant that chancellors could not be easily dismissed, as they were in the Weimar Republic, if they didn't have backing from the Bundestag. It was the responsibility of the Bundestag to find an alternative chancellor within 21 days, etc., etc. There are other things you could bring in there. You could mention, for example, the fact that the power of the president was reduced. Okay, there was no Article 48. Mention the Constitutional Court that was actually staffed by political lawyers, very different from the Weimar Republic. All of these factors came together, and what they did is they prevented extreme right-wing parties, such as the All-German Bloc, the League of Expellees, getting seats in the German Bundestag, unlike the 1920s, where fringe parties like the Nazis were able to get influence in the Reichstag. So it marginalised anti-democratic parties. So that's the sort of key thing you need to be talking about. That the basic law was an improvement on the Weimar Constitution. It retained the best elements of the Weimar Constitution, but it then strengthened them. Okay, other things you can mention, and again, you're limited by time, so you just got to be very, very punchy in making key points. So Adenauer's government was built on democratic values. Okay, so you could mention the fact that he was drawn, his support came from Ordo liberals. Social cohesion, it drew support from across the spectrum. Catholics, the conservative right, labour relations promoted social cohesion, the 1949 bargaining law, workers represented on management committees. All of that is evidence that his government was always working towards democratic values, social cohesion. He took actions to eliminate political extremism. So, for example, in 1952, he banned the neo-Nazi political party, the Socialist Reich Party. Reintegration of former Nazis into key positions in society arguably assisted democracy. It was common sense. Although they were Nazis, their expertise helped promote economic recovery. e.g. Globka, ex-Nazis in the Foreign Office, etc., which therefore strengthened democracy rather than weakening it. Adenauer's economic policies. He understood that economic recovery would prevent radicalism from flourishing and thus make democracy secure. So the social market economic principles dictated the success of the FRG. So again, what most candidates do with this is they rattle into a description of the social market economy, and they talk about Erhard and market policemen and how there was 8% growth per annum, etc., etc. But all that information will not score you marks unless you relate it to the issue of democracy. And that means you've got to say that the Weimar Republic in the 1920s, democracy lost popular backing because of economic weakness. And Adenauer understood, therefore, that economic success was necessary to underpin democracy. Democracy would be more secure if it was propped up by economic recovery. So the economic recovery is therefore made relevant to the question. Similarly, Western integration. Adenauer understood that one of the reasons the Weimar Republic failed in the 1920s was because Germany was subject to the terms of the Treaty of Versailles. In other words, the West, Britain, France and America, treated Germany like an enemy, the ex-enemy from World War I. And therefore, in the 1920s, Germany was basically on its own. Okay, sure, the Dawes Plan brought American money in for a short period of time, but then that was quickly withdrawn with the Wall Street crash of 1929. But the key difference is, moving forward 25 years, is that this new country of West Germany was propped up and supported by the Americans, the British and the French. Western integration. And Adenauer knew that. He knew he had to turn his back on the East and move Germany into a new direction that meant working with the West in order to make democracy secure in the long term. So again, you're relating the information to the question about democracy. So yes, all the information about the Schuman Plan and joining the ECSC and the General Treaty, which opened the way for West German sovereignty, the European Defence Community and NATO, etc., etc. All that's important background information, but the examiner is looking for you to relate that information to the principle of making democracy secure. So don't let the information drive your paragraph. The key point is that Western integration strengthened democracy, and then just give examples of it. You don't need to bring in all of that detail. You can see why you need to spend more time on building block X. And then in the final third of the answer, you're basically balancing your answer by showing an awareness that although you are arguing that Adenauer was absolutely central, he was the driving force behind the creation of West German democracy, through his aims, through his principles, through his responsibility in creating the basic law, through his dogged looking westwards, etc., etc., you can still turn it around. And you can still say, but it's not as simple as that. So building block Y, your line of argument is, in some ways, Adenauer does not deserve that reputation because. And some examples of that. His political style was very bullish and undemocratic. He liked getting his own way. There's a good opportunity there to bring in information from beyond the textbook. A really good example of this is it's actually in Williamson, on page 64 of Williamson. You might want to make a note of that if you've got the scan. where he rode roughshod. Well, he basically wanted to create a commercial television company, and it was borderline unconstitutional. And he was quite ruthless in his pursuit of it. The Deutschland Fernsehen and GmbH affair in the early 1960s, and it's a good example of his very, very undemocratic style, because it rode roughshod over the separate states who controlled television. For good reasons, part of the Constitution, and effectively the intervention of the Constitutional Court forced Adenauer to back down. So there were occasions when he did ride roughshod, where he was very undemocratic in his style. You can revisit that notion of denazification, the fact that it was incomplete, the fact that he did issue amnesty laws. You could argue, therefore, there was a rather questionable moral foundation to the West German government, which did undermine its democratic credibility, because many high-ranking ex-Nazis did have high positions in public office. Many war criminals were freed. And so, although, yes, on the surface, West Germany was very democratic and it was very stable, beneath the surface, you could argue there was always a question mark, particularly with young Germans, about the moral foundation for West German democracy. So those are the key points there. Building block Z, a brief paragraph. There were other founding fathers. Turn it around. If Adenauer played that sort of counterfactual approach, if Adenauer had, he was an old man, let's say for argument's sake that he had died in 1949, what direction would West Germany have taken? There is an argument that West Germany would still have developed as a democracy. Why? Okay. The Ordo Liberals, they were clearly very important. We mentioned Erhard. Erhard was, in many ways, at least as important as Adenauer. The economic recovery provided the foundations for democracy. If Adenauer had not been there, you could argue that Erhard and the social market economy would have paved the way for the new Germany to be a strong democracy anyway. You could argue that the Allies played an equally significant part in creating democracy. You could argue, as in fact, the East Germans certainly argued this, and also Schumacher himself, that Adenauer was just a puppet, that his strings were being pulled by the Allies, and that maybe we need to give more credit to the Allies, in particular the Americans, Marshall Aid, its contribution to economic success, American involvement in creating and improving the basic laws, the occupation statute. Everything was subject to, in particular, American and British approval. All of those were sort of key factors. The Korean War, I've not given that as an example there, but that was really an issue of luck. Playing a part in history. It happened at exactly the right time. It suddenly made West Germany important to the Americans because the Americans needed West German economic muscle as the Cold War developed. Those factors helped Adenauer establish democracy. Okay, so Adenauer was helped along by other factors, is what we're saying there. So, conclusions, counter-argument to the above, that the German economy would have grown in spite of US aid, that Adenauer's great skill, like Bismarck, there's again a good synoptic point, always look for those opportunities. His great skill was as a pragmatist, as an opportunist. This is sort of taking the counter-argument that Adenauer was a puppet, but like Bismarck, in a sense, almost like Hitler himself, opportunists could see how external events could be turned into opportunities. And Adenauer's great skill was he was able to ride the waves and respond to those external developments and use those events to strengthen democracy. So then it comes back to Adenauer. He was a pragmatist, he was an opportunist, he had a long-term goal, a vision. On occasions, his short-term policies did seem to ignore democracy, but this was necessary to strengthen Germany in the long term. Economic success and international support ensured the support of the German people for the FRG. And that never happened in the Weimar Republic. In the 1920s, the German people, the millions of Germans, never really bought into democracy. Whereas Adenauer had a deep understanding that if democracy was going to survive in the long term, it needed to be popular, and popularity was based on economic success and international support. So he pursued those long-term goals in order to make democracy more stable. And ultimately, Adenauer proved himself to be correct, because his critics, of course, said that he turned his back on 17 million Germans living in the East who were not part of West Germany. But Adenauer always believed that a prosperous